All right, welcome everybody in the Sales Enablement Society. I'm Juliana Stancampiano, and we are starting our very first episode of Tales from the Trenches. And I'm really excited to be able to be with Mike Kiely today. He is the Services Portfolio Enablement and Messaging Director at Dell EMC Services. So he's going to have to explain that title to us, first of all, as we do this. But Mike, it's great to have you on our first podcast.
Great to be here. Thank you, Juliana.
No problem. So the intent of the Tales from the Trenches for the Sales Enablement Society is that a lot of members ask lots of questions. We have a really active community. Sales enablement is still a fairly young profession. And Walter and I recently had a conversation, and there's been a lot of us talking about, how do we get more messages out about what people that we see as kind of being successful and having some luck in the role have been doing and what their experiences are, so that we can scale that and help others to learn from both, the things that you've done really well, maybe the things that haven't worked so well, and get that message out. So that's what prompted us to do this. And I'm excited that you're our first person on. I personally saw a post of yours in the community, which led me to ping Walter and say, hey, who's this guy? This is a super interesting post that he wrote about content for sellers specifically. And it was quite a long response that you wrote. In fact, I took it out and put it in a Word document so I could more easily read it. But it was fascinating to me. And I think, something that we don't talk a lot about is what, content does resonate directly with salespeople, and how do we just create that instead of things that we think maybe resonate with them. And don't, maybe they're prettier than they need to be, or more polished, or more, customer branded than they need to be. Right. So that's kind of what prompted us here. But Mike, I'd love for you to share with the community a little bit about your background, sure, and kind of leading up to where you're at today.
Sure. So yes, my title's very long today. And essentially all it is my past experience at EMC, now Dell Technologies, as we merged 2 years ago. Was focused on what I call our core sellers. So those are the sellers that sell, the hardware and the software of then EMC, which was a global storage company, more than that, but that's what I'll call it, and now Dell Technologies. We also have a services organization, like many companies. So I essentially, my role today has shifted a little bit, where the services organization invited me over to help them, because they have a very complex portfolio of services, and we're still trying to wrap our arms around that. So I'm responsible for, as you said, the messaging and the enablement across all of these services. So it's very similar to what I did. And let me step back a little bit there. So I've been with EMC. I won't give you the total years, because then people will start to do the math. But before that, I sold for IBM for quite a number of years, 15 years or so. And I sold a lot of data center outsourcing services. So it were services, a little different, intangible, hard to touch, and hard to present to a customer. Yeah. But at the same time, I have to say, with IBM back in the day, I can't tell you how true it is today. It opened doors. You can imagine a young seller in their 20s being invited into a meeting with a CIO of a large insurance company or a large financial firm. You might say I was in way over my head at that time. But I learned since then, being a frontline seller and working my way through the ranks at IBM, I've really learned how to read customers, what resonates with them, and also interfacing with marketing, both at IBM and at EMC. I also realized as a seller what resonated with me. Resonate with me. So I took that over to EMC. EMC gave me an opportunity. I was in their headquarters. So I came out of the field, a more headquarters person, but most of my time was spent focused on the messaging, really the street level message, the conversation. So I spend a lot of time to this day with our customers in the executive briefing center. So I do talk to customers regularly still, of all sizes. But at the same time, I'm always talking to our field to understand the pulse of what's going on out there. So I'm tapped a lot to help with their messaging, their enablement, even though I'm now on the services side, I'm still kind of indirectly involved in being invited into all sorts of places. So that was probably a long-winded way of using a little bit of my background, but that's what I do.
Yeah, that's great. And it's fascinating. I think so many of those things, services, marketing, sales, they all intertwine, right, at some given point. So that's terrific that you've got all those things as a part of your background. I'm kind of curious if you can back up for us and talk a little bit about, and we're going to try to make this as tangible as possible.
Sure.
You know, where and how did sales enablement kind of come about at EMC? And what did that look like when it first started to resonate or come about as a conversation topic?
Sure, that's a good question. And you know, things have changed a little bit now that we're Dell Technologies.
Right.
I won't get into a lot of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm representing, these are my opinions, just make
totally.
Sure and that. But you know, when I was at EMC, what had happened was we had no sales enablement organization. Now we're going back to 2010, and if you recall back at that time, sales enablement was still being defined. You know, different companies were defining it in different ways. The right content in the right place at the right time was one of those definitions. And since then, sales enablement has kind of expanded. Should it or should it not include training? What other things should it include? Should it include customer-facing material, et cetera? So really, we were in a meeting, the way it came about. I was in a meeting with some of the sales execs, and they were talking about how there was something going on in APJ, actually, and they discovered that when it came to sales calls, we were providing all types of training to our reps, but when they went to execute, they weren't actually executing. So they were quote learning, but they weren't really applying that and executing. So it was a discovery for all of us to say, wait a minute, I think we need more than just training. I think we need some type of an enablement. And that's how it ultimately came around. It started with that right from the sales leaders, which we'll touch on is critically important in my eyes if you're trying to especially form a sales enablement organization, is that kind of alignment. So I lucked out a little bit that I had that alignment. I shouldn't say alignment and credibility, but I had the alignment.
The relationships there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is kind of a critical point that you talked about just briefly for our audience, is that it came about because the training wasn't working, right? And so it became a discussion about, well, how do we fill this gap between the training and actually the doing, and that's where the enablement started to come up. Right. So, you know, we hear a lot about, well, what is sales enablement? You know, is it training? Is it, you know, what is it? And so I'm kind of curious in your mind, and I'm not a huge fan of that word training either, because I think it started, you know, we're hearing that lots and lots today, because it doesn't necessarily say what kind of activity is going to be done out of it, right? So you have a bunch of information, now what? So I'm curious to know kind of how that went from an enablement perspective. What did you guys mean by, you know, the training's not working and now we need enablement?
Sure. What we were finding was, we didn't remember back then, training was simply a webcast, right? A recorded webcast. Right.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just in time type of training. It wasn't bite-sizable, you know, chunks of training. It was, oh my
really
God,
long.
I have to learn something for tomorrow's call, and I got to go sign on for that training and, you know, find slide 40 and see if it has what I need.
Right.
So there were some discoveries there. We needed to make it real time or just in time was one of them. The other thing was, so it was a combination, if I had to break it into categories. We started off by saying, okay, let's focus on knowledge. Do they have the right knowledge, product or service, whatever it is? Do they have the right skills? Can they apply some of that now in a sales conversation, or know how to work through the pipeline? And I'm not talking inside sales, just the sales process for an outside seller. The tools, obviously, we didn't have the tools at the time. So what tools do we need to help deliver this? So it was really kind of, you know, knowledge, skills, tools, and of course, process. Was there a globally consistent process? So that's kind of how we started off. But for me, what I chose to do is grab a quick hit, is what I'll call that.
Okay, yeah, because that's a lot of different areas that you just listed off, right? So where'd you actually begin? What did that look like?
Yeah, so what I did is I felt in order to get credibility with the field leaders, it's one thing for them to ask you to go do something, but when it comes back to forming the organization and getting funding, you have to have credibility with your customer. In my eyes, it was field sales and these sales execs. And I won't get into all the other stakeholders with sales enablement, but at that day, they were my customer. They made this request. So I had to decide, how do I wrap my arms around this? So believe it or not, I attacked the skills right from day one, where we had 3,000 sellers. We had to get them skilled up on some pretty new offerings that we had created, and we had to do it rapidly. And how do you do that with 3,000 sellers where, oh, by the way, they said, we can't bring them all in, okay. Right? So you have to figure out a way where we somehow teach them in a new way, right. and get them moving, get them selling, get them credible, get them proficient in this in a rapid way. So that's what we latched on to. And one of the things to gain credibility that I found with field sales is I worked with the field. So a little trick that I do in order to gain credibility with our sales leaders is, let's say there's an initiative and they want us to do something for them. I will go out to various sellers that I know, direct sellers, could be first line managers, could be regional vice presidents, could be direct sellers. Mm-hmm. I talk to them about, I throw out these ideas. What are your thoughts on this? And I actually get their input and their triangulation and their suggestions. We used to call it kind of, we'll develop this with the field, by the field, for the field, with the field type thing. Mm-hmm. So we never created something where we said, here it is, here you go, field, we know better. Right. We always had the field have a little bit of a hand in it. And as a result of that, because they participated in some of the, I'll call it creation, meaning their ideas, some of them we'd incorporate in, and immediately we'd have kind of buy-in with a lot of those key sellers and credibility with them. And then we go back to the sales leaders. I'd go back and say, look, I went out to your divisional vice presidents. I went out to these sellers. I went out around the globe, and here's what I discovered. Here's what I found. And if you do that, most sales leaders will not push back because you went right out to their folks. And that was a huge learning point for me early on, was this whole process of how do we gain that credibility so we can then sell back your solution or your approach back to your sales execs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm writing some of these tangible things down, right? So field involvement in everything that you do, essentially.
Yes.
It's getting their input and their feedback, but not necessarily telling them they have to go create the thing, whatever the thing is.
Right.
It's just it's like extracting their knowledge from them so that you can create something that they're going to believe is going to be helpful for the rest of the organization.
Exactly. And the other challenge for anybody that's been doing this is when you go out to the field, you have to structure it in a way where you're asking for input and you're asking for some of their opinions on gaps. You're going to get 100 different points of light. All right. So your job is to try to correlate all these different points of light into something tangible that perhaps you can address versus 100 different challenges. So that's one of the things that we had to do. And the other thing is, anybody that goes out to the field, that they're going to say, hey, I have the best way of doing things. Let me send you this 20 slide deck or this whiteboard that I do. Again, it's your job to kind of cut through a little bit of that noise. This person sent me something way too technical, not repeatable. But there is something in here that we can use. So there was a lot of that I did. So my focus was purely with the field from the get-go. And it really paid off because at the end of the day, we had sponsorship to grow the organization rapidly because of that credibility of getting to the field and understanding their challenges.
So literally growing the sales enablement group.
Yeah, absolutely. that's kind of how I align. The other thing where, and it's hard for folks in sales enablement, I understand that. Like in my organization, I tried to build it out with people that have sold before. Now, that's not your primary criteria. I understand that there are a lot of people that are probably excellent in sales enablement, certain components of it, but maybe they've never sold. I have the luxury of still talking to customers. So I have the luxury to see the reps, kind of doing their thing, seeing where they falter. But I also have the opportunity to test out our own message or conversation. And that goes along, that's great for credibility. So I can at least, if I'm on a call with sales leaders, can say, I just spoke to the CIO of Boeing, and I'm making that up, just a week ago. And I found some interesting things during our conversation. Immediate credibility there, and that has kind of helped, at least in my case, to build out the organization.
Yeah, and I think, you make the point, you're very close, which is awesome, to the customer, obviously, and having those customer conversations as well as the sales force. And we've worked in many organizations where, the enablement people don't have any touch with the sellers. And, that's something that we try to bring in as well. And I think that's another point, to note, is that we've got to do it with sellers and with your audience. And if you can get in on customer conversations, maybe you're not having them, but if you can go to one or, sneak in on a call and listen to how they actually go, it leads, to so much more helpful for you to be able to do your role.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And another way that I establish some credibility is, as I said earlier, you'll get a lot of input from the field, some of it good, some of it complex. There are going to be some times where, let's say there's a star seller out there, well-respected, everybody loves them, and you got some good information from that person. Maybe it's a process or a message that they use out in the field. And you might look at it and go, gosh, it's ugly, it's not repeatable, but this person's just killing their number. So there was some sacrifices you have to make. To your point earlier, how pretty do you make the content? Make some sacrifices. If there's a certain structure that this individual loves and they claim that their local geo loves it, run with it as a starting point. See how it goes. Don't fight it. And it's these little things that all of a sudden, then they start to let go, and they'll say, hey, Mike, I trust you and your team. You guys will do great things with it. Just go do it. So over time, you establish that freedom to make it better. That's the other thing that I had found too.
Yeah, that's great. And I think part of what I'm hearing you talking about as well is going out, and if you can understand a lot of different areas or hear the conversations, you start to probably pick up on the patterns, right, from a scale perspective. So you have a very large organization, a lot of people that you support, you have to make stuff that's going to be able to scale, and you have to be able to suss out those patterns. And I think, that's something that's possible when you can talk to 100 people if you have such a large organization, or if you have 10, talk to all 10 and pick out the 1 or 2 patterns, right, that you hear in those conversations, and kind of use that as a guiding point potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, some of the patterns I had found was, our folks went within the first 2 minutes, not uncommon for any salesperson. Remember, I sold for a long time. You're dying to go right into your product, right? And we know as sales enablement people, it drives us nuts. But when you put yourself into the salesperson's shoes, I have a limited period of time in front of this customer. I have pressure from my manager to kind of sell this thing. I got to talk about this thing, and they, within 2 minutes, they go from hello to let me talk about my widget. So I had found that was a pattern, and not surprising. And it was like, how do we break this where we differentiate ourselves a little bit just by way of the conversation we're having? So it was those types of patterns that I had uncovered early on, which I don't think is uncommon across a lot of tech companies when you look at the sellers. And it's not to knock them, but that's typical.
Yeah, and it's a lot of the stuff that they're being given too, right? Absolutely. Is about the products and the offerings or solutions or whatever it is. And so that's where I should start.
That's a great point. That you kind of hit on that too. A lot of the information that they get typically comes from product marketing. Great folks, but they know their product and they know it well. And they believe that every feature that they just added in that dot release, they got to put in there and you better mention it.
Yes.
With sales enablement, your role is to go, oh, thank you, product marketing. That's good stuff. Or product management. Excellent, excellent. Yeah, we'll take care of it. And then you kind of do your thing and craft it and pull out the nuggets and make it repeatable. And
yeah, we call that a translation layer.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Like between that part of the org and then I love this, what'd you say, street level messaging?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I'm going to use that term, and it's like taking, so product marketing, street level messaging, the thing that happens right here in my mind is enablement, is sales enablement, to get it there.
Yeah, and cool. Around the messaging, I had this diagram a while back that illustrated the alignment of the message all the way from, say, the analyst meeting level or the quarterly meeting level down to regional meetings where you still had a pretty big audience, but it was a big stage and your message would be different. It might be a 40-slide PowerPoint, but then the next level down might be an executive briefing center, maybe 5 customers in the room, a CIO, and some of that person's executives. But then that street level conversation is even that next level down. And I used to illustrate to the company that, look, all of these are different in the way they're executed, as long as they're aligned in some way. Clearly, we don't want our salespeople to talk about our company differently than how they're talking about the company up here. Mm-hmm. So as long as they're aligned, but you're right, I call that the street level messaging is to me the most critical. And I call it the sales message, but to define it for everybody, I say the street level message, street level conversation.
Yeah, it's so relatable, that phrase.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so I'm going to pivot this a little bit. I'd love to hear some of the challenges that you ran into early on, and kind of if you can tell us how some of that was navigated and what you did to get through it. That would be helpful, I think, for our audience.
Sure. So remember back in 2010, 2011, a lot of these sales tool companies were not out there yet. There's some great companies now for content, for video training, real time. A lot of that wasn't there. So some of my challenge was, we didn't have the budget to buy outside, especially if you're talking a 4,000 person sales organization and you multiply that by a dollar per seat, gets expensive fast, and they typically just shut that down. So I had to figure out ways to do this kind of in a grassroots way. So my first challenge was, it was a team of one, which was me. And then as we got through the first big, I'll call it a sales enablement event, which really was a global training where instead of bringing all 3,000 or 4,000 salespeople together, we brought just the sales managers together in the US, in Asia, and in EMEA. And we spent 2 days with each of them. So I set up the agenda. I brought in some outside speakers and some sales leaders. And then we actually did some real-time training and coaching and actual role playing. Mm-hmm. And then we came up with a whole mechanism to cascade that out. So the managers, we would then give them some facilitation training, and they were required to then go out and have these meetings. And required meaning it was measured. Everybody was scored. How did your reps do engaging in these conversations? So it was a good forcing function. But the way we did it, I think where I made a lot of progress and credibility is through the conversations that we were creating. We based them off of real accounts. I was in front of customers, so I tested out. So a lot of it was stuff that I tested in the real world, and it got a lot of stickiness, and the field loved that. But that was a challenge. It was one person. If you're starting off, my recommendation would be bite off something that is a gap today and address that. The tools, the this, the that, there's so many things that can just really drive you nuts. But I think you just got to do some quick wins, because without those short, quick wins, your sales folks are going to eventually go, well, what are you doing for me?
Right.
So that was my big challenge, trying to figure out, where do I start? And then how do I slowly grow? And that was my initial challenge.
So you brought up a great point, and I think it's really fascinating between like 2010 and 2019 is that there is a huge influx of technology, right? That we have. So how do you go about making kind of those decisions today? Because on one hand, maybe there wasn't enough in 2010, or it wasn't, as easy to buy, or, as cheap as it is maybe today. But now, spin the world a few times, and now we have so many. And how do you decide what you do without creating too much noise, of all this stuff going towards your sellers?
Yeah. So if you're in sales enablement, you hear a lot from technology folks, and all good, it's important to understand what's out there.
Yeah.
With me, I had a unique challenge because of the size of our sales organization. A tool would quickly get expensive. Now, I'm not talking Salesforce, for example, we're a Salesforce customer.
Okay.
In the CRM, we have all that. And a lot of our stuff is built in-house. So we originally had built the first kind of YouTube style video on demand in-house. That was all in-house, global network. But now today, there's a lot of content providers that can give you things right at your fingertips on an iPad or an iPhone. My recommendation would be we're very selective. For example, my company, we don't just choose them. We'll really try to understand, and we'll go to the field to see if they'll really use it. And the reason I say that, we've gotten not burned by a vendor at all, but we piloted things where you'd think you loved it, and as an enablement person,
amazing. Yeah.
This is so awesome.
Yeah.
And then the field doesn't use it.
Yeah.
And no matter what you try to get that stickiness, a sales exec will only push so much. If their sellers are selling and they're winning, I don't want to bother them with these other things.
Yep.
So it's trying to really figure out what tool is not too overboard, what tool is giving them just what they need. So today I see a lot of, I look at a lot of content, a lot of training in the sense of video on demand, this whole role play thing where a manager can look at a video and add comments on how their rep's doing.
Yep.
Pretty cool stuff, especially when you have to scale it remotely. But it's the stickiness that is just so hard to get. That to me still is a challenge to me. And I don't think there's a silver bullet there, but that stickiness is always a challenge with the tools.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, no, I think I think it helps. I think we're all kind of navigating it, and, we're seeing similar to Dell EMC is very similar with the larger companies. A lot of them have made it in-house, or, have kind of gone that route versus potentially buying something that's on the market. And so, it's a combination of lots of things probably. And to your point, we're seeing a lot of proof of concepts happening to just see if it's something that's going to resonate or not before a company's making a decision to go all in, because exactly to your point, you have to see if it's going to be useful and consumed, and then how do you measure the success of it, and and be able to see the results.
And if I were to do it over, I would, if back in 2011, for example, or 2012, these tools were available, I definitely would look to honestly buy first before building. Building it in-house is a process.
Yes,
and
that's
really
good.
just going through and and just making sure you go through the cost analysis and the total cost and the ROI. If you do that right, my challenge was we had already invested a ton of money internally, so it was hard. You already had that uphill battle. So but we got around that. We execute. The field loves us. Like they look at sales enablement as you folks bring some credible readiness, skills and knowledge to us, and we love it. And that goes from things like account planning processes to if they want to execute on the challenger, we've done things like that. So there's a lot of different things that we'll train them on based on what's going on in the market with them and the competition and what the other sellers are doing.
That's great. So this has been a great conversation. We're coming up on 30 minutes, and I promised I wouldn't go too long so that we don't, right? It's like, no, it's all good. I think we could keep going for quite some time, so we'll have to have you back. But are there any kind of last thoughts that you would leave with somebody that is maybe, been hired in and trying to get a sales enablement team up and running, or trying to get stakeholder buy-in? Kind of what are your last thoughts on those topics?
You know, it's funny. I haven't. It's fun, and this isn't a self promotion, but I did put something out on the site, on the SES site,
Okay.
kind of a 90-day, 120-day plan, and it's
There you go.
you know, quickly assess the situation, you know, align, and then take action. I think I put it into those
Quick wins. Yeah.
You know, and you know, if you're new at it, just assess as much as you can. Go out to the field and assess. Yeah, you got to talk to marketing and the other stakeholders, but talk to the field, assess the situation, figure out the quick hits, quickly identify and align with the key stakeholders, and just do it in small chunks. Start off small, because I don't think you're going to get the headcount dollars. It's you know, the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the headcount dollars until you prove yourself a little bit. You or your small organization. So it's that type of thing. So, you know, I do assess, align, and then act. Those are the three things.
Got it. And I think the key thing that I have heard so many times while listening is the alignment with your audience and your customer, and understanding them. And then if you can, your other customers, which are the customers of the business,
Yes.
so that you can understand that. And if you're able to see that view and impact from that perspective, you know, it's not just marketing, it's not just your internal groups that are your stakeholders. It's really your sellers and your customers. And that's I think a really nuanced point to be very specific about for people, that, you know, to go, and it's not just your boss. It's not just, you know, just the business side. It's more holistic than that.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Terrific.
All right. Hopefully you found this helpful, interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, this is great. I appreciate it. I'm sure we will have you back on. So Mike, thanks so much for your time today.
Great. Thank you, Juliana.